Hello, and thanks for watching this NABS talk about grief and loss. My name is Marisa Posadinu, and I'm one of the senior support advisors at NABS. Outside of NABS, I volunteer for Cruse Bereavement Care as a bereavement support worker, helping support people through their grief. I've also had personal experience of loss in my life, and I know too well the profound impact that it can have. In life, I think we're all taught how to succeed and achieve, but we haven't necessarily been taught how to deal with loss. And so when it happens, we often don't know what to do or what to expect. And although we will all experience a bereavement at some point in our lives, as a society, we still find it very difficult to talk about grief. COVID-19 and everything that we've had to cope with over the past year has prompted us at NABS to start to normalise conversations around grief and loss, exploring the impact that it can have on us and how we can best support ourselves and one another. If there is a silver lining, then I think it's that COVID-19 has shone a light on grief and loss on a scale that we simply haven't seen before. And this can only be a positive thing in helping us to talk about this sensitive topic more openly. Grief and loss is such a huge subject, and it's constantly evolving through research and learning. And so this talk today will only really scratch the surface. The objective is to increase our understanding about grief and loss and have an awareness of the unique impacts that COVID-19 has had on grief. And finally, to explore some of the ways in which you can support yourself if you have lost someone in your life, or how you might be able to support someone that you know who's been bereaved. It's important first to ground ourselves with what certain terms mean. Bereavement is what has happened. It's the death of someone that results in you no longer having that person in your life in body. Grief is what we feel, and many would also argue it's what we think. Mourning is what we do, and the obvious example here would be at a funeral service. But it's also what we do externally beyond that. So that could be other mourning rituals, it could be storytelling, crying, just to name a few. So grief is our internal processing of what has happened to us, and the mourning is our external processing. They're not separate, and they do interact with one another. Anticipatory grief is a set of feelings and reactions that occur when someone is expecting the death of a loved one. An example here would be if a loved one has been diagnosed with terminal cancer. Emotions can be just as intense as the grief that is felt after the death, and it doesn't make the process of grieving any shorter after the death. The impact that this can have on us can mean that emotional and practical support is so crucial during this period, both in our home lives and also at work. There are so many myths around grief and loss, and I thought it'd be helpful just to focus on a few of them here and to dispel them. Time is a healer. Now, I'm sure we've all heard this expression before, but when it comes to grief, time is unfortunately not a healer. There is no doubt that for some people, time can make a difference. Many will describe how the rawness of grief felt in those early days, weeks, and months can start to ebb away, and the grief can start to feel a little bit more manageable. Often people describe it as a background sadness, but that they can function and that they can lower the volume of their grief. But to say that time is a healer is misleading. It's actually other factors that will contribute into how you'll experience grief, and we'll come on to those shortly. The point here is that if somebody has experienced a bereavement 5, 10, 15 years ago, it doesn't necessarily mean that the more time has lapsed, the better they will feel. It's absolutely not the case for many people. I'm not grieving in the right way. So people can often feel that they should be grieving in a particular way. Their expectations of how they thought they would be feeling and reacting and how long they thought it would last doesn't match reality. Grief is such a unique and personal experience that there is no right way to grieve, although there may be some similarities in what we all go through. I can't seem to get over it. We might feel that there's an expectation placed on us to somehow get over it, but you can't just get over someone who's died, who you really loved, or who you experienced other strong emotions for. A more helpful way to reframe this is perhaps by thinking about how you can move forward with your grief, living a life with meaning and purpose again, but not losing connection to the person that you have lost. I have to say the right thing. We can often feel the pressure in saying the right thing to somebody who's been bereaved. This can lead us to feeling nervous, and what can sometimes end up happening is either we avoid the subject, or perhaps we even avoid the person, or we might end up saying a cliche phrase that isn't particularly helpful. The important thing to remember here is that there is no one right thing to say to somebody who's been bereaved. I know it perhaps doesn't feel very helpful to hear, but everyone copes so differently to grief. So what we do know to be true is that grief has no time frame. At first, we might find this a little disheartening to hear that there is no end in sight. But on the other hand, there can be some comfort in knowing that there is no set timeline by which we need to feel normal again. Everyone reacts and responds differently to loss in their life. Not only that, but every bereavement is different. We may have lost someone significant in our lives 10 years ago and felt that we coped relatively okay at the time. But then we might experience another bereavement more recently, and that has had a much more profound impact on us. And we'll look into the reasons why this may be shortly. There is no hierarchy in grief. So what that means is that there's no one bereavement that is more important than another, and every bereavement is significant. Sadly, however, some people can feel a sense of shame in their grief, or that there is a stigma attached to their loss. We often see this with people who've been bereaved through suicide or drugs and alcohol. Others may have a sense that their grief is less important or perhaps not even valid. And we can often see this in parents who have suffered a stillbirth or a miscarriage. Grief can be complex and messy. Grief isn't a linear experience or a set process with set stages and emotions within a set order. Research will tell us that approximately 7 to 10% of us will experience grief over a longer period of time, and it can become quite complex, and it's actually called complex grief, and it has a more profound impact on how we're able to cope and function in the world. Finally, what we know to be true is that losing someone close to us at some point in our lives is inevitable, and that it will sadly happen to us all. But grief is a normal and natural reaction to loss. So what makes grief messy? Well, there are various factors that can contribute into how we experience grief. The first thing that we need to look at is who the person was who died. What was their role in our lives? What was the quality of the relationship with them? What did they mean to us? And how did they contribute to our lives? The second factor to consider is what type of attachment did we have with that person? Now, we could have been close to that person and had a secure attachment with them. But if we didn't, and our attachment to the person was insecure or complex, we might feel as though we should have been close to them, but we weren't. And we can then feel a profound sense of loss for the kind of relationship and attachment that we wish we had with that person, but that we didn't experience when they were living. How they died can also play a part in how we experience grief. Perhaps it was a sudden and traumatic death, or perhaps we witnessed the death, or perhaps it was a long or short painful illness from cancer. Whatever it might have been, that can also influence on how we grieve. And if we do experience a loss in our lives, it can sometimes trigger grief for our previous losses. And also, if we experience more than one bereavement in a relative short space of time, that can feel as though the grief is mounting on us, and that can feel very overwhelming. Our personality and outlook on life is another factor. There are differences in how we cope and how we engage with others, and this leads us on to social factors. Support is one of the biggest elements that can help us when grieving. It doesn't mean that we have to have lots of friends and family around us all the time. It can be that we just have that one person who we can really trust and confide in. What's important is that we have that support and we know when to access it if we need it. Without that support, it can be very difficult indeed. Other stresses are things that are happening in our lives at the same time that can make the grieving harder. An example would be if perhaps we're facing redundancy at work, or perhaps we're facing relationship difficulties in our personal life. Anything else that is happening at the same time that is causing us anxiety and stress can impact on how we grieve. Stigma or shame, now we touched on this earlier, and some people might feel as though they don't have the permission to grieve for their loss, or that there's a stigma attached to the death. and this can make grieving much more difficult. 2020, as we all know, was a year like no other, and the start of this year has continued to be very difficult for so many. It can't be underestimated the impact that COVID-19 and the pandemic has had on the bereaved. Thousands of families have been unable to see their loved ones before they died. They've been able to touch and hold them, and able to say their final goodbyes. Thousands of families have also been unable to hold the type of funeral services that they would have ordinarily done so, or they've been unable to carry out their normal mourning rituals. Normally, when we grieve, we surround ourselves with our friends and family. But as we all know, this hasn't been able to be possible. Many feel that the pandemic has put life on hold. They can't plan for future events or holidays, or they can't get involved with activities that they once enjoyed. Or they can't seek solace in those normal social interactions, such as being in the office. And also the usual routes that we may have once taken to seek face-to-face support has also been disrupted. Many of us have turned to seeking support virtually, either through social media, phone helplines, or via Zoom. But online support won't be accessible to us all. And all these factors, and there will be many more, have intensified the feelings of grief, isolation, loneliness, and even anger and guilt. Loss doesn't necessarily have to involve a death. Loss can involve so many other significant things, such as a loss of a job, loss of income, loss of identity, loss of confidence. Here are some of the less obvious and less tangible losses that we might have experienced over the last year and that have had an impact on us. And of course, there might be many more. The important message is that grief can be experienced in times of change. So whenever change occurs, there is the potential for feelings of loss. So although we might not immediately recognise it, mixed in with the whole host of feelings, reactions, and thoughts that we might have experienced over the past year is grief. The way that we navigate through grief will be unique to us. It's our own personal journey. So what might work well for someone else might not necessarily work for us. And as we've already established, there isn't a timeline to grief. But there also isn't a list of tick box exercises that we need to get through to magically erase the pain and the sadness. However, there are ways in which we can support ourselves following a bereavement. The first one being opening up to someone that you trust. It can sometimes feel like we're a burden to those close to us, but by talking about what you've experienced and how you're feeling is so vital when grieving. Many of us are fortunate enough to have supportive friends and family. Others may not have that, and this might make their experience of grief much more difficult. Find that one person who you can really trust and confide in. And if things at work are difficult and you're struggling to focus, try approaching the subject with your line manager or confiding in your HR team or a colleague. Accessing additional support. So grief can often manifest itself physically, and this can be quite worrying. Just think of loss of appetite, disrupted sleep, aches and pains, or even panic attacks. Do speak to your GP if you're concerned about any of this. And as mentioned, grief can be messy and complex, and there might be other things happening for you in your life that is adding to your grief. Sometimes we may want to speak to somebody outside of our friends and family, and there are so many specialist support organisations out there that can help you, and you'll find a list of those under this video. Self-care is incredibly important. It can be so easy to dive back into work and keep yourself busy as a distraction. But in doing so, you could neglect your own needs. Do whatever you feel comfortable with and that gives you some joy or comfort at a pace that is yours. In the early days especially, self-care could simply mean trying to get enough sleep and rest, eating well, and trying to get some movement or meditation into your day. Give yourself time and permission to grieve. Now, this could be carving out time to think about the person that you've lost and what they meant to you. It could be looking through some old photographs, or it could be listening to a song that reminds you of them. It can also be really powerful and cathartic to write down how you're feeling through journaling. This could be writing down a couple of sentences a day, or even recording a voice note. Losing someone that we love is such a tremendous change in our lives, and there'll be so many things that we're unable to control. It can be difficult, but try to focus on what you are able to control and attempt to let go of what you cannot. It's also important to let your family and friends know what support you may need, both practically and emotionally. You may hear cliche phrases from those around you about keeping positive, or they may talk about their seemingly perfect lives with their loved ones, and they may not realise the impact that this is having on you. It can be helpful to remember that people generally have good intentions, but that they won't always get it right. The more that we're able to have compassion, empathy, and knowledge around death and grieving, then the more effective we'll be in supporting one another. If you are supporting someone who's been bereaved, then listening is the most powerful and helpful thing that you can do for them. Everybody wants to feel heard and feel supported. People who've been bereaved will often want to share their experiences and the memories of their loved ones. Be supportive and be available to listen to the same story, perhaps more than once. It can be really hard for the bereaved to come to terms with their trauma and their loss, and so repeated stories are common. There is no one right thing to say to somebody who's been bereaved. Try not to be fearful of saying something wrong or perhaps not knowing what to say. And if you don't know what to say, it's okay to acknowledge that. You don't have to have the answers or a solution. What can be really powerful is acknowledging how that person is feeling with compassion and without judgment. A suggestion could be to say something along the lines of, I can hear that you're feeling upset or angry, and that is completely understandable after what you've been through. Things to avoid are cliche phrases that we so often hear. So phrases like, at least they're in a better place now. At least they've lived until a good age. Time will heal. You'll get over it. Be positive. They are unhelpful, and they can have the impact also of minimizing someone's loss. Try not to be fearful to ask the person how they are doing and how they are feeling. I think we can sometimes feel nervous about raising the subject, as we might worry about making them upset. The truth is, by asking someone how they are won't make them feel any worse or more upset about the situation than they already do. It's communicating that you care. That said, the person may not want to talk about how they're feeling or what they're going through, and this is also a natural response. So we might need to feel comfortable with the silence. Be guided by that person and the pace that they want to take. The important thing is that you're demonstrating that you are willing and available to listen to them when they are ready. Being available means being available for the practical side of things as well as the emotional support. People who are grieving can sometimes struggle to reach out for support, and they might have difficulty in identifying or articulating what it is that they may need. So rather than saying, let me know if you need anything, it would be more helpful to be more direct with how you might be able to offer someone some practical support. Perhaps you know that the person that you're trying to support will be experiencing the first anniversary of the death of their loved one, or perhaps a birthday or another significant milestone without that loved one. Sending a text, an email, or perhaps giving them a call to say that you're thinking of them communicates care and that you're there for them to talk. We all have a cultural background that forms our views, our experiences, and belief systems. Talking about bereavement might feel more difficult if we're supporting someone from a different cultural background to us. For example, they may be taking part in mourning rituals that may seem very different to our own. And it might be difficult to know how to be sensitive to a grieving person from a different cultural background to us. Consider asking questions to learn more about their customs, beliefs, and practices around death and mourning. And if the person that you are supporting is struggling, you might want to signpost them to culturally specific bereavement support organisations, which we've also listed below. And finally, just to stress, everyone reacts so differently to loss. And so be patient and be guided by them in what they may need. Thank you so much for listening. I really hope some of it resonated with you and that you found it helpful. And if you do want to seek some support after listening to this, the NABS advice line is here 5 days a week. Our small team of 6 advisors can offer emotional support, practical guidance, or simply a listening ear. We can also be here to talk to you about our other services within NABS or signpost you to other external support organisations. Thank you so much for listening.